All right. We are live on Armageddon News. Today, Lloyd and myself, my name is Thaddeus. We are guests here on Armageddon News, and we're going to be sharing some material on Islamic Dawah, which is roughly equivalent to Christian evangelism. This will be our second stream on the subject. In the first one, we kind of just introduced what is Dawah and looked at the characteristics of the person doing Dawah according to Bilal Phillip's manual. If you didn't catch that stream, don't worry. We're going to briefly reintroduce the subject when we get started. But even if you, so if you didn't catch it, you might want to watch it later, but you don't have to have seen that to understand what we're talking about today. Today's completely independent of that. We'll be looking at the characteristics of the called, that is the one being given Dawah, the one who is trying to be influenced to join Islam, and we'll see how the advice Bilal Phillips gives is intended to manipulate the person, to trick, so to speak, both the person doing the Dawah and the person receiving the Dawah into joining Islam without actually realizing what they're doing. Lloyd, do you have anything you'd like to say?
No, the usual. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you learned from this. Please use this information. Hopefully, we provide you with a great deal of content that you can come back, reference, and utilize in your own missionary work or refuting the very many poor Islamic arguments by their apologists. So, yeah. And also, if you have any questions, post them in the comments, in the chat. We definitely pay attention to what goes on in the chat and the comments, and we're here to help.
Excellent. And I'd just like to point out that Lloyd and I both have our own channels. We do some similar material on our channels. So if you like what you see today, be sure to check out both of those. Without further ado, I think we're going to dive into some Islamic fun facts to kind of set the mood before we look at the Dawah manual.
All right, so I'll share my screen. You need to re-enable it.
Oh, yep, sorry. I forgot to do that.
Thaddeus doesn't trust me to share my screen. He's concerned
it's off by default, and I have to turn it on every single time.
All right. Just a brief mention, we are going to be doing at some point, discussion of the madrasa manuals. So expect us to do that. You'll see that they're equally bizarre as these Dawah manuals. But let us get started. Right, so some Islamic fun facts.
I don't think the screen share is on. At least I'm not seeing it.
Oh, you are correct. My bad. That was my bad. Okay. Right, so here we go. So let's have a look. This is Sirat Ibn Kathir, volume 2, page 94. Now, someone today in the comments told Colin from Islam Critique that he was using random online sources when Colin referenced Ibn Kathir, who is regarded as one of the two top Islamic scholars of all time in terms of those who write these tafsir and these commentaries and biographies of Muhammad. So this is one of the heavy hitters in Islam. And a Muslim was blatant enough to say that this is some random no-name. Yeah. When Urwa stated, here's Mursal, incomplete as we mentioned above, but in its content, blah, never mind. His statement, he contracted marriage with Aisha when she was 6, thereafter consummating marriage with her when she was 9. It is not disputed by anyone and is well established in the Sahih collections of traditions and elsewhere. And this is from Sirat Ibn Kathir. This is Ibn Kathir's Sirah of Muhammad, which is effectively the equivalent of the Gospels. This is one of the top scholars of Islam, one of the top scholars of Islam, confirming she was 6 when they married and 9 when the marriage was consummated. So hopefully at some point Muslims will start to agree with their own scholars rather than lying about it. Yeah. Let's have another look. So women are dogs. The things which annul the prayers were mentioned before me. They said prayer is annulled by a dog, a donkey, and a woman. I said, and this is Aisha, right? Narrated on the authority of Aisha, the mother of the Muslims. I said, you have made us women dogs. So Aisha said that Islam and Muhammad have made women dogs. Your interpretation of that, Thaddeus?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward that women are on the same level as a dog or a donkey, that any of those three are so vile, so to speak, that they will invalidate your prayers.
Yes, women are impure, so impure that they will invalidate your prayers. That's really, really frightening. Let's continue. Oh, and that was Bukhari, by the way. That is Sahih Bukhari, right? So let's continue. The Prophet said, leave her, as she does more than this. Once there was an altercation between the Prophet and Hazrat Aisha. You might have heard of Aisha, Muhammad's wife, the 6-year-old. When they found Hazrat Abu Bakr as their judge, I believe he was her father, Hazrat Aisha said to the Prophet, you speak, but don't speak except truth, because she was accusing Muhammad of lying to her. At once, Hazrat Abu Bakr gave her such a slap that blood began to ooze out from her mouth. So Abu Bakr, in front of Muhammad, hit Aisha so hard that blood began to ooze out from her mouth. Now, they always say tap her with a toothbrush. Do you think maybe do you think this is a toothbrush related incident?
Well, doesn't sound like it, but of course, Abu Bakr's her father, not her husband. So, maybe fathers are allowed to beat their daughters more severely or something.
Yeah, but I thought these men were nice, sweet, wouldn't harm a woman. I thought they set the example. He was a caliph of Islam after Muhammad. So yeah, so there we go. And that is from Al-Ghazali, of all people. Al-Ghazali is regarded as the #1 scholar of Islam after Muhammad. And that the book is called the Ihya Ulum al-Din, Volume 1. And in English, it is the revival of the religious sciences, the Ihya Ulum al-Din. It is widely regarded as the greatest work on Muslim spirituality and is perhaps the most read work in the Muslim world after the Quran.
I
And
also just,
yeah,
before you go on, I'd also like to point out that, the, what kind of father is like, a dispute between his daughter and a friend of his who has since married her, says, not only takes the side of the person who isn't his daughter, but then so violently decides, he's right, so I'm going to beat you for even doubting him. I mean, what the heck?
yeah, yeah. I mean, just tells us a lot about what's going on here. So I wonder if we read through this book, what else we would find. That's a question. And the final one, this is from the Minhaj al-Taliban, and this is one of the most well-regarded Sharia manuals by Imam Nawawi. And as we know, Imam Nawawi was the head at one point and considered perhaps the most prestigious of the heads of one of the 4 schools of jurisprudence. And he says here, at the first indication of disobedience to marital authority, a wife should be exhorted by a husband without his immediately breaking off relations with her. When she manifests her disobedience by an act which, though isolated, leaves no doubt as to her intentions, he should repeat his exhortations and confine her to a chamber, but without striking her. And he may have recourse to blows even where disobedience is manifested by an isolated act. So he may have recourse. So he might choose, or there might be reason to beat her. That's recourse to blows, even if it's an isolated single incident. And when there are repeated acts of disobedience, a husband may inflict corporal chastisement, beat her with a stick, in other words. Just thought I should put this out there. This is from the Sharia, from highly regarded scholars. So yeah, any thoughts before we get back into the actual discussion?
Well, even if we take out the violence for the moment, we can still see clearly that the wife is supposed to be subservient and subject to the husband. He first inflicts emotional abuse on her, and then if that doesn't work, then, or he feels otherwise, he can inflict physical abuse. but even if it's just emotional abuse, it's still abuse. And, you
Yeah.
know, people who've been through this might say that the emotional abuse is worse than the physical abuse. So there is no aspect of sympathy here. There's nothing good about this.
Yeah. And also, if we compare this to Jesus, I mean, I see Muslims online saying compare Muhammad to Jesus. Well, then that makes Muhammad a Messiah. And how many women did Jesus beat during his lifetime?
That would be 0.
Exactly. How many slaves did Jesus own during his lifetime?
Also 0.
You know, how many caravans did Jesus personally rob during his lifetime?
Also 0.
Exactly. I think there's a pattern forming here. So yeah, how many people did Jesus torture by burning a fire on their chest?
Definitely 0.
Exactly. So yeah, I think the morals of Muhammad leaves a lot to be desired. So let's go on. So now we're discussing Dawah, interfaith dialogue. So this is from Bilal Phillip's Dawah manual, and he states here the popular phenomenon of interfaith dialogue attempts to blur the essential issues and put all religions on an equal footing. He claims that since all religions call to goodness and righteousness, it is assumed they should all be tolerant and accepting of each other. Clearly, he means no, this is not the case. We're not on an equal footing. We do not all call to goodness and righteousness, and we should not all be tolerant and accepting. So, meaning there is no need to try to convert each other's followers. Peaceful coexistence is what is needed. And he says here, such a call is dangerous and it is fundamentally false. There is only one true religion, Islam, and all others are false. So they've introduced the interfaith dialogue concept after centuries of vilifying and demonizing the final prophet Muhammad. And Muslims have an opportunity here to present their evidence for the superiority of Islam. Your thoughts?
Before commenting on that, real quickly, there's a comment from Brenda who says that you should look at people as individuals. You can't judge a faith as the whole. Well, certainly, I would not say that every Muslim believes X or every Muslim is a bad person or every Muslim beats their wife or whatever. You certainly can look at the teachings of a religion and judge the religion as a whole. I mean, your position is you shouldn't, basically, that you can't judge anything as wrong. You know, if a group comes out with a document that says, uh, let's say, you know, they say that all people that sorry, let's say they say that all females should be made into slaves, and then you'll be like, well, you can't judge that group. That document's just published by the group. Not all the individuals believe it. Well, we can certainly judge that document, and that's what we're doing today. We
Yeah,
are judging the Islamic texts. If Muslims reject these texts, great, but then they're not really following Islam anymore. We agree that these texts are crap and they should reject them, and we're glad anyone rejects them. But when you reject the fundamental teachings of the religion, then you're not really a member of that religion anymore, now are you?
yeah, this is the scripture and this is the doctrine. So individuals are separate to scripture and doctrine. We are quoting what is said by its founder, by Muhammad himself. This would be the equivalent of the words of Jesus in Islam. So this is what Jesus of Islam did. This is what their scriptures contain, and this is what their doctrine teaches. Anything, any single action of Muhammad is sunnah. It is legal, it is moral, it is valid for all eternity because Muhammad cannot be criticized. Every single thing Muhammad did is right. If Muhammad punched his wife in the mouth, that is legal, moral, and valid for eternity. That is the doctrine of Islam.
So getting back to the interfaith dialogue, we, of course, would largely agree with Bilal here that there is only one true religion. Of course, we would not say that it's Islam. The reason we point this out, however, is because we often hear from Muslims that, you know, can't we all just get along? We're all basically the same religion. Uh, and they only bring that up when they're in a position of weakness. You know, when they're in a position of strength, if you go to say Saudi Arabia, I guarantee there aren't any Muslims going around saying Christianity is great, everyone should just get along. You know, they're just about all saying that Christianity is horrible, it's an obviously false religion, and so on, which I'm okay with them saying it's a false religion. From their perspective, it is. But don't then turn to a Christian and when you're talking to them, pretend like something else is true, just so you can win the day.
Yeah. So this is what they teach Muslims. So if Muslims are taught this growing up from the age of 4 to the age of 15 or 16, why are they contradicting this with us in public when this is what they truly believe? So they're lying to us. They're being dishonest. So yeah, so let's look at the characteristics of the called. Now, are they interested in conversion or clear communication? Now, he says they're not really interested in conversion. They just want to communicate because they want to, because Muhammad was a plain warner. Muhammad was the messenger. So they believe that they need to be messengers like Muhammad, except that was only valid in the first part of the Quran. In the second part, the Medinan section of the Quran, Muhammad was no longer a messenger. Then he was a political leader and a warlord. So here they are adhering only to what we would call the Meccan Quran, but not the Medinan section of the Quran. Any thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, I think that the section of the manual, and I should point out that everything that you see on the screen is a screenshot from the manual, other than the headers that are our description. We did the first time we did this, we just put the manual up on the screen, but it was really hard for people to see, so we cut some portions out. But everything is word for word from the manual. This isn't our interpretation. This is word for word. So this Quran verse he quotes kind of seems to teach predestination or determinism, that Allah decides who is saved and who isn't. But that contradicts the idea of doing Dawah. So Bilal is trying to walk a very fine line. On the one hand, he's a scholar. He knows that the Islamic texts are very deterministic. But on the other hand, he knows the people reading the manual probably don't have that belief because it's not very common in Islam today. And also he wants them to do stuff for them. So he has to kind of walk this fine line. So it's always his way of manipulating them, that he kind of tries to change the meaning of the verse slightly.
Right. So he says Allah guides whom he wills. In other words, Allah decides in the Quran who will receive Islam and who will go to hell and heaven even before they're born, which is a really interesting path to take. Which is, why do they then need to compel us if Allah's already decided, but yet they have to punish us, even though it's Allah's decision whether or not we become Muslims? So yeah, their job is to convey the message, right? Clearly, as Allah says. Now, the only obligation on the messenger is to give the clear message. And we are not there to win the argument or the debate. Our goal is to make sure they properly understand the true message of Islam in its pristine purity. However, online, they're always there to win the argument because they remember they have to show the superiority of Islam. He contradicts himself constantly. The thoughts, that is?
Yeah, I agree. There's nothing particularly bad about this advice, just to give a clear argument and let it be. But that's not what we ever find in practice, that it's always about giving random points that you think will embarrass Christians or convince Christians to become Muslims. And if they don't agree, just keep beating them over the head with more and more random quotes. It's all about winning. It's 0% about giving a clear message in practice.
Yeah, because they're taught that they are superior. Remember, we are the worst of beasts. They are the best of creation. And this is the message they are taught. So this is not something they can actually carry out. This goes against the actual behavior. But we'll see. There's this constant, what's the word? Cognitive dissonance that you'll see. So they speak about how to convey the message of Dawah and listen before you speak. Yet they are always full of propaganda talking points. And they've never read the Quran, the Bible. Notice, these people have not read it. They've not read the actual scriptures.
Yeah, again, there's nothing in this section that's particularly bad advice. It's perfectly good advice. It just doesn't match practice.
Yeah, he says, put yourself in the other person's shoes and be gentle. However, we also know from the Sharia that that if they find any resistance to their message, they are to be harsh in response. So this is really, really interesting. However, it should be noted that they do isolate that they should try to get someone alone, someone whom they're trying to take the message to. They should try to get them alone and not deal with them in a group situation. So he just says, you read the situation and timing. And he says in Sahih Bukhari, Ibn Abbas, which is Muhammad's cousin, said, lecture the people once per week if you must, and then twice. And if you must be frequent, then thrice, but do not make people bored. So he goes to great lengths in this section of the book to tell people, don't bore people with the Quran. They're very concerned that people will find the Quran boring.
And for good reason. It's one of the most disorganized, repetitive, boring books ever created, in my opinion. And I'm not just saying that because I don't like Islam. I can read the scriptures of a wide variety of religions and, find them entertaining. I find the Roman myths about their gods to be quite entertaining. The Quran is just really boring. It has very little story. It's just
Yeah.
say this and say that, and then 2 chapters later, repeats the exact same words again, and they'll jump from one point to another with no indication why whatsoever.
Doesn't it
It's just
repeat
really
the
hard to
story of
read.
Noah like 7 times?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I don't know how many Noah's mentioned specifically, but most stories are repeated many times.
Exactly. So he says, ask yourself, am I giving them too much? In another hadith, the Prophet said, among the signs of an individual's understanding of his religion is the length of his prayer and the shortness of his speech. So that would also be the case of, I believe, self-indoctrination, that they are to spend time constantly thinking about praying to Allah, thinking about Muhammad, and saying very little. Well, yeah. So he's very concerned about saying too much. Now, I think they should take the opportunity to speak. But then again, we'll get into reasons, and we have also in the first episode as to why he doesn't want them to say too much.
Yeah, absolutely. As a Christian evangelist, I have never had the thought, am I telling this person too much? Because, I believe the more they know, the more likely they're going to see that the facts align with my beliefs. So, why is Bilal so afraid of giving too much information? Is it because the more information you have, the harder it is to reconcile the facts with what Islam teaches?
And yeah, I think that's exactly the case. Let's go to the Sharia, which starts to explain some of this. There's more in the first episode, but in the Sharia, within the Islamic law, the sacred law of Islam, it says in section A4.2 in the Reliance, as for the basic obligation of Islam, it is adequate for one to believe in everything brought by the messenger with absolute conviction, free of any doubt. Now, as we read further, we'll learn that you shouldn't be taught anything. You're simply just to accept what you've been told and believe it just like that. Not to question, not to know more, but simply to believe what you are told. So if you're going to start telling people, you're trying to convince them with reason, whereas really you want them to just believe like you do. Whoever does this, whoever believes with absolute conviction, whoever does this is not obliged to learn the evidences of the theologians. So if you can just believe with no knowledge of what it is you're believing, you don't need evidence. So the Prophet did not require of anyone anything but what we have just mentioned, nor did the first 4 caliphs, the other prophetic companions, nor others of the early Muslim communities who came after them. What they demanded was absolute belief, without doubt, and no knowledge. Your thoughts, that is?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty shocking here. It's like if you have knowledge, that's almost worse. If you need knowledge, and we saw this elsewhere in the Sharia, that if you need knowledge to accept Islam as true, then you're an inferior Muslim. That the best Muslims just accept it without question, do whatever they're told. As a commenter on my channel likes to say, we hear and we obey.
Obey. I know, it's crazy. So yeah. And he goes on then to explain this further. Now, the Reliance of the Traveler, also known as the Umdat al-Salik, is the most famous Sharia manual in the world. It's readily accessible, easily available for anyone to download and read. This is the most common one used across the Muslim world. What befits common people and the vast majority of those learning or possessing sacred knowledge, which is Sharia, is to refrain from discussing the subtleties of theology, lest corruption, difficult to eliminate, find its way into their basic religious convictions. So, in other words, discussing the details will cause you to develop doubts, which they consider corruption, and it will be hard to eliminate these doubts. So, rather, just believe or thinking about these things will corrupt your religious convictions. That is insane. That just shows they know that their own beliefs don't make sense.
Yeah, pretty crazy stuff there.
Yeah, it is better for them to confine themselves to contentment with the above mentioned absolute certainty. Now, how are their missionaries and how are their online apologists supposed to provide answers if they're supposed to just be certain without knowledge, without details, without information? That makes no sense.
Yeah, we see this even like in debates between Muslims and Christians. You know, the Christians will give a bunch of arguments, and then the Muslim will just go up there and say absolute nonsense, but he'll say it with a lot of confidence, a lot of
Yeah,
bravado, and then the Muslim audience will go, "Yay, good job!" You know, he could be just making stuff up off the top of his head, and it doesn't make any difference what he says, as long as he says it with confidence.
yeah, exactly. And listen here, Imam Shafi, who's the founder of the Shafi'i school of jurisprudence, Nawawi was the one who succeeded him and became the most prolific of the and most respected of the scholars within the Shafi school, as I recall. Imam Shafi went to the greatest possible lengths to assert that engaging in scholastic theology is forbidden. Engaging in theology is forbidden. So you are merely to regurgitate what you are told rather than to actually understand your theology. So what he meant thereby was the heretical. Now, this I think was added in as an excuse or a way to explain that away. But he meant heretical scholastic theology that proliferated in his time and put rational theories ahead of the Quran and Sunnah. So at the time, there was a group, for instance, one group called the Mutazilites, who were utilizing Aristotelian logic, which is logic which requires the of non-contradiction. And what we have here is he was saying that is heretical to use logic to utilize the rational part of your mind to use rational theories is actually heretical and forbidden. So Islam is anti-rational.
Crazy stuff. You'd think that the true religion would be in compliance with human reason, but apparently not.
Yeah. So being rational is heretical in Islam. And this is according to the major scholar of the major school of Islamic jurisprudence. So yeah, these are incredible thoughts. And Bilal Phillips then goes on and he discusses how to convey the message of Dawah and to know your audience. He then says Tawhid, which is the oneness of God, being Unitarian. Instead, all their questions focused on what Islam had to say about homosexuality, and he tells a story. In the course of their questions, I came to realize that I was in a homosexual church, and the members of my audience were mostly homosexuals and lesbians. This was not the appropriate. This was not appropriate. The time was not appropriate for the subject of my lecture. I was giving them the message of Tawhid, and they wanted to know what Islam says about homosexuality. Do I tell them that the punishment for homosexuality is death? Or should I inform them that they are to be thrown off the highest mountain? ISIS did throw people off the highest buildings. No, this is neither the appropriate time nor the suitable circumstance. So your thoughts, that is?
Yeah, well, you know, knowing your audience is some reasonable advice, but he uses this opportunity to apparently make up this story, um, because I find it impossible to believe that Bilal was just invited to some random church to give a talk on Islam. That's improbable enough. But then he didn't bother to look up anything about that church before he went there. And then that somehow this church turned out to be a gay church filled with homosexuals only. Uh, I think he just made up the story, and his real purpose, although it's nominally to say know who you're talking to, it's really to give this subtle hint that, you know, those Christians are really bad people. They believe in a lot of immoral stuff like homosexuality. Christians support homosexuality. You should definitely not be one of them.
Yeah, I've never heard of a homosexual church. One that is, this is, he doesn't state which church. He gives very little by way of actual citations in terms of what he discusses here. But notice he does inform his audience who are reading this, right, the people that this book is aimed at, that the punishment for homosexuality is death. And he says that they should be thrown off the high mountain. So he's letting people know this is the law. He's actually indoctrinating them, telling them this is what you have to do. And but he doesn't also tell his audience that he's speaking to in that supposed church the truth, right? This is not the appropriate time or the suitable circumstance. He's not being honest. Why can't he simply be honest? If he is fulfilling and speaking the word of God, then he should have no shame in that. But yet he realizes that, I mean, this is going to be a huge issue if he starts telling them, well, I need to kill you. And once we're in power, you will have to die. He says, I gave them a general answer. And after the talk and the answer session, I went to them and talked to them individually about purity, about relations with a wife, and about the blessings of having a wife or a spouse. As individuals, they listened for another hour, but as a group, they just wanted a quick answer when they left. So we have to carefully read the situation, determine if our topic is suitable for a group, or if it's better to talk to individuals. Now, how these individuals, I mean, did he really have time to speak with all of them at length?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the whole thing is almost certainly made up. So he can say whatever he wants. But I think what he's really trying to do is get the person reading the manual to realize that you shouldn't be sharing embarrassing things about Islam in a group setting. I think that's his real motive here.
Yeah. I think he's aware that if he had to say that, he would have no idea how to respond. There's no way he can offer them forgiveness. It would simply be, you do what I say, or death. That he'd be giving them an ultimatum. And this would be very difficult. So Muslims are taught to rather change topic. I think what he's hinting at and what he does explicitly eventually get to is that change the subject, change the subject, change the subject. Don't try to defend anything, change the subject. And this is exactly what we find in online discussions, online debates, live debates. Muslims change the subject.
Definitely. We had a comment earlier that said there was no use researching the Great Babylon, the satanic religion. Well, I disagree. I think that it's very useful to research what your enemy is teaching. If you understand your enemy, you can much better counter their arguments. And, you know, even if we say 90% of Muslims have no interest and could never be reached, that's still 10%, which is, you know, 100 million people. There's a, even if we make that probably ridiculous assumption that 90% of Muslims are unreachable, that's 100 million people who are lost and need Jesus. And you're saying don't bother? I mean, how silly.
Yeah, that's so then he goes on. So how do we convey the message of Dawah? Now I'll get to that. So tailor the message to the individuals. In other words, he's saying rather isolate people, get them alone. Right. So this is the chapter that he's talking about tailoring the message to the individual. So he's saying try not to talk to groups, talk to people in isolation. I did not send any messenger except that he spoke the language of his people to explain to them. Surah Ibrahim 14:4. Now, there are three elements that we must keep in mind when giving dawah. So there's knowledge of the Quran, and the Sunnah is one element you may use. So you may speak of the Quran and the Sunnah. You may utilize knowledge. But remember, we just said earlier that apparently it's wrong for them to actually know too much and to discuss it, because to discuss it is to introduce doubt, which will cause them to eventually reject Islam. And he says it's more important for you to have a degree of eloquence. So a smooth tongue is more important. And he says here, evidences and proofs are important, but to reach the audience, you need to have a good speaking manner. So he's really talking about be a salesman. Don't give them the facts, just give them pleasant sounding words.
Yeah, like use as many facts as you need to, but no more. And if some of those facts aren't actually true, well, that's okay too. As long as it sounds good, you know, you can use evidence if it benefits you, but don't bring in evidence for no reason. Uh, and make sure you're talking good. I also wanted to point out that this is a good example of how Muslim scholars make the Quran say whatever they want it to say. He's using this verse to say to tailor the message of Dawah to a person, but that's not remotely what the verse says. The verse is talking about how a messenger or prophet was sent to each group of people, and Muhammad was sent to the Arabs speaking Arabic because no one had been sent speaking Arabic previously.
Yeah. If Islam is for non-Muslims, why none of the English translations apparently reliable? And where's our English speaking prophet?
Yeah,
And
good
why can't
question.
Allah speak English?
Good question. Very limited God. It apparently only knows one language, Arabic.
I know, and it's really, really fascinating. So yeah, so Bukhari says, you may still not reach that person unless you can speak to them in an eloquent manner. So they are meant to be glib, not to be factual. They are meant not to provide information, but to simply sound good. I mean, that already it tells us, look, these are used car salesmen. This is not how you deal with technical questions, because further in the manual he teaches you to dodge every technical question. Don't try to deal with technical questions. Change the subject and then speak about the superiority of Islam, which we saw earlier. And he then goes on to talk about dealing with misconceptions, right? We have to decide whether to spend time trying to correct the misconception or to choose another tactic or another topic. And guess what? He says, choose another tactic or another topic, right? For example, raising the sun from the west. This is in reference to the story of Prophet Abraham when he went to the king. Now, is there a biblical story? And I don't believe there is, where Abraham goes to a king and then Abraham raises the sun from the west to set in the east. So where does the Quran get this story? Indeed, Allah brings the sun from the east, raised the sun from the west, and the disbeliever was dumbfounded. In the cow 2:258.
Yeah, I don't know where he got this story from, but it's a really odd choice for Bilal to raise. And I think he probably raises it because, probably like me, he's never heard anyone raise that as an objection against Islam. And he doesn't want to raise one of the real objections because that might give the person reading it doubts. So he just raises this non-issue that no one has ever brought up. Now we might point out that it's not a biblical story like Lloyd did, but I've never heard anyone say that Islam is false because God couldn't make the sun rise in the east if he so chose.
Yeah, he chooses some really random examples, and I don't understand the book, the thinking behind the book. I don't know. He's just dodging. He seems to be dodging everything as well. It's like it's just so weird. So he was stupefied and completely unable to respond. I don't know if that's the effect he wants to create here, but similarly, rather than stopping to explain each and every time, becoming so bogged down in defensive explanations. So again, they realized they're going to have to be on the defensive because people are going to ask them some very difficult questions. And he says the situation may be avoided by raising issues which clearly demonstrate Islam's superiority. He's forewarning them, and he does again throughout the manual elsewhere, that you're going to be dealing with difficult questions because people are going to ask you things about Islam. And he then says, don't try to answer them, just change the subject. In other words, convert people while they are ignorant and have no idea what they're converting into.
And then he
And
gives this example, which is pretty hilarious, about the issue of polygamy. And first he tries to say that the West doesn't really practice polygamy because, people have multiple girlfriends and mistresses and whatnot. And then he makes this ridiculous claim, which I've also heard Zakir Naik and other Muslims apologists make, that Islam's the only religion whose scriptures explicitly say to marry only one woman. I think on the next slide we have the actual verse, which doesn't teach any such thing.
Yeah, so why does he lie? Because he blatantly lies about that Islam is the only religion that says to marry one wife. It says you can marry a single wife, but, and this is what he quotes here, he says, if you fear you will not be just, then marry only one wife. And that is Surah Nisa, which is Quran 4, verse 3. So this statement often stupefies the detractors as neither the Bible, the Torah, the Gospel, when he says the Bible, he means the New Testament, nor the Hindu scriptures contain such a statement, which is shocking because the Bible certainly does. But he says their scriptures encourage unrestricted polygamy. Where in the West is unrestricted polygamy allowed? I would love to know, right? And on such occasions, it is important to read the circumstances accurately. But let's have a look at the actual passage in the Quran, Quran 4:3. If you feel that you will not deal justly, then marry those that please you of other women, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you feel that you will not be just, then just marry only one, or those that your right hand possess. Of course, those that your right hand possess happens to be captured slave girls, whom you can also utilize as sex slaves, even though not married.
Yeah, so he's just taken the middle part of this verse and made it say something totally different than what it says, because it really says marry 2, 3, or 4 women. And if you doubt that you can handle that many women, then marry one woman. So it certainly doesn't say anything remotely like marrying only one woman. And then after that, it gives the exception for slave girls. So even if you do fear that you won't be just and decide to marry only one woman, you can still have sex with as many sex slaves as you like.
Yeah, this is the level of dishonesty that just drives, it's crazy to see this online. It is unfortunate that we have to deal with this level of dishonesty, but think about it. These online apologists who are so misinformed, so dishonest, they are learning this level of dishonesty and they're being lied to by their own scholars. These scholars that they trust are lying to them and misrepresenting all of their own scriptures, and they are simply repeating the same lies. They are indoctrinated into being liars, which is really, really sad.
So part of the moral of the story here is if someone gives you a Quran verse that seems to say something, look up the actual verse and see if it actually says what they claim it says.
Yeah, it's really, really upsetting. So then he speaks of the choice of subject, right? Now it says here, Muslims spent a lot of time trying to convince Christians about the authenticity of the gospel of Barnabas. Was that really important? Now, if they believed in the gospel of Barnabas, would it save them on the day of judgment? No, because they believe that Christianity is false. And he says, is everything mentioned in the gospel of Barnabas the truth? No. In fact, there are passages and concepts contained in it which are incorrect and go against Islamic teachings. However, if you look at various books written by Muslims today, which are meant to refute Christianity, many of them cite the gospel of Barnabas as proof of the superiority of Islam and the falsehood of Christianity, even though it is written, 1700 years after Christianity came about. It's insane. And he says, then he further goes, well, let's pause there, Thaddeus. Your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah. So for those who don't know what the Gospel of Barnabas is, I don't blame you. I had been studying Christian apologetics, knew about dozens of extra biblical texts that were written, in the second, third, fourth, sixth, whatever century, that, sometimes are informally called the Gospel of whatever or the Epistle of whatever, that didn't make the New Testament for good reason. They were later on. But I'd never even heard of the Gospel of Barnabas. That's how ridiculously incredible it is. It was written in about the 16th century in either Italian or Spanish by either a recent convert to Islam or someone who was Christian, nominally Christian, but sympathized with Islam. They wrote it in an attempt to synchronize the two religions, as near as we can tell, that they wanted to end the violence that was going on as the Islamic armies invaded those nations. And they tried to make this fake gospel that largely supports Islamic doctrines. Bilal's right that it doesn't get everything correct, but it much more supports Islamic doctrines than Christian doctrines.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to, so, it's a total crap source. No one with any hint of objectivity would ever accept it as anything other than a product of the time and place it was written. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the historical Jesus. It was written 1,000 years after Islam was founded, let's say. And in addition to that, notice what Bilal doesn't do here. He doesn't tell his believers to stop using, or he doesn't tell them to stop believing this text. He doesn't tell them the real reason why they shouldn't use it, which is that it's total crap. It's non-historical source. He just says it gets a few things wrong, so it's not a good idea to use it. And he's walking this line because he knows a lot of his audience believes it. It's very common in Muslim circles to say that the gospel of Barnabas is very close to the true gospel from before Christians corrupted it. So it's just, he doesn't want to tell the audience the truth, but he doesn't want them to use this source either because they'll be called out on it. And then they'll be like, why the heck were our leaders lying to us about this gospel of Barnabas crap? And then they'll start maybe doubting Islam. So he doesn't want them to use it, but he doesn't want to tell them the real reason either.
Yeah. Also, what's interesting is the Quran quotes from other heretical gospels, which are Gnostic gospels. I don't even know if we should really credit them as being Christian, because they're not, they call them Christian Gnostic texts, but Gnosticism is not Christianity. These are heretical texts, which are actually anti-Christian, because Gnosticism was a pushback against Christianity in an attempt to correct it or refute it. And they utilize stories from the infancy gospel of Thomas and from the, so Islam is known to use heretical text. This is also nothing new. It's interesting that Allah doesn't actually know the Bible. He believes that the Trinity is Mary, Jesus, and God. So Muslims, unfortunately, continue in that same proud tradition of ignorance. I mean, if it's the same God as the Christian God is Yahweh, how come he doesn't know his own Bible?
Good question. Or even if we put in the ridiculous assumption of Muslims that the real gospel is lost and corrupted, how come he doesn't know what Christians believe? How come he criticizes a belief that no one actually holds?
Yeah. And also, how come Muslims are often so eager to use profanity against Jesus or against God and so on, if it's the same God? If it's the same deity, how so? Clearly, they don't believe these are the same deities. So actions do speak louder than words in this case. He goes on to say, many Christians do not believe in the Trinity. Well, if you do not believe in the Trinity, that makes you not a Christian. And some believe that there's only one God and that Jesus Christ was a prophet of God. He doesn't specify which group, because I don't know of any Christian groups that believe that Jesus was merely a prophet, except for those that are clearly not Christian, but are, false sects.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to thousands of people who call themselves Christians in my lifetime. I've never heard one say that they thought that Jesus was only a prophet. Now, some people are confused about the Trinity. Some people don't really understand that or know what to believe about it. But I've never heard anyone say Jesus was a prophet, and especially never heard anyone say that Jesus was a prophet who predicted the coming of another prophet, which would be the final prophet that everyone should follow, like Muslims believe. So he's giving his audience a false expectation here. But I think that he's doing this because, he doesn't want to get bogged down and talking about issues. He just wants to rapid fire one thing after another. So, don't spend a lot of time talking about the Trinity. Just say the Trinity's false and it doesn't make any sense, so don't believe it anyway. that's what he wants people to do. And that's what we see in practice, that Muslims will often use this confusion that people have over the Trinity, and they'll say,
Yeah.
we basically believe everything you believe, but you're confused about the Trinity, so are we. It doesn't make any sense. Become a Muslim. But of course, that's not remotely true. There's many, many differences between the religions besides the Trinity.
So as much as he doesn't want Muslims to know their own scriptures and their own doctrine that derive from those scriptures, he also doesn't want them to know the truth of Christian doctrine and Christian scriptures. I think one difference, an amazing major difference, is that we as Christians, we study Islamic scriptures and we study their doctrine so that we can represent it accurately. They, however, lie about it, and he lies about it here in the most vague of terms with no specificity, no details. He doesn't clarify any of his statements. He makes assertions, and again, I think implicitly he is teaching his people to assert without facts.
I agree.
Yeah. Now, he says here, we may find that it would be more beneficial to talk about Prophet Muhammad. I would prefer to call this man Messiah with a small m, Muhammad, because clearly Muhammad holds the same authority as Allah. And if you read in the Sharia, he does. He most certainly carries the same authority as that of Allah. And they are required to love him the way Christians are required to love Jesus. And without praying to Muhammad, and I use those words carefully, Allah does not receive your prayers. Allah does not regard your prayers as worthwhile, and Allah will not answer them or regard you as a Muslim unless you give fealty to Muhammad as well, which is very much an idea and a concept plagiarized from Christianity, where no one goes to the Father but through me, and those are the words of Jesus.
So we just had someone join the chat. Kofi asks, are we talking about Muslims and Christianity? And yes, specifically, we're looking at a Dawah manual, which is the Islamic equivalent of evangelism, to learn how Muslims try to convince people that Islam is true.
Yeah. And so yeah, last week I did show some sections from the Sharia. I'm not sure if that's worth doing so now, but it is required in the Sharia that Muslims must love Muhammad more than their life, their wife, their children, their wealth, their family, than everything in the world. They have to hold Muhammad in such a regard that they love him more than themselves, more than anything that they believe. So this is what they require of Muslims. So that, I think, is where ultimately Muhammad is their Messiah. And in fact, Muhammad is regarded as the Shiloh. He is the one who seizes or receives the scepter of authority from God at the end times. So he is then considered to be greater than Jesus. He replaces all of the authority of Jesus and takes it upon himself.
Yeah, definitely. You know, the Muslims say that all the prophets are equal, that Muhammad was just another prophet, and yet he's given special status that if any other religion gave someone that status, they would instantly see it for what it is, elevating him to a divine status.
Right. Yeah. So I was trying to bring up the Sharia manual with that, but I've had some other PDFs open on that. Yeah. So now he speaks of method of delivery. And he says, although emotional arguments are to be avoided in general because they tend to cloud the issues and the facts, sometimes emotional arguments are the best methods, which is really interesting. Now, again, this is very much consistent with the fact that they don't want Muslims discussing the details or even knowing the details of their own theology. And now he says, use emotional arguments. Now he says here, on one occasion, Muhammad, the Messiah of Islam, gave a sermon in which his eyes became red, his voice became loud, and his anger increased, which is a really strange image. Here we're talking about a man whose eyes started to glow red. That may be appropriate in a Friday sermon, but he says here, finally, emotional arguments are also important for motivating people for jihad. So your thoughts?
Yeah, I like to call this hadith here that he's quoting Muhammad, the red-eyed demon. He says, getting angry and speaking with hatred is appropriate for Friday mosque service. Very interesting because
Yeah.
apparently it motivates people for jihad, and that's actually he's actually exactly right. That is how you motivate someone to go fight, to tell them that everyone is evil and be really angry about with them, and say all those people are really angry, or I mean really evil, get really upset about how horrible they are. And so he's right, but it's very bizarre thing to admit to.
Yeah, no, it's just he wants them to feel emotional, right? And this imagery of Muhammad, his eyes became red, his voice became loud, his anger increased. This also is very much reminiscent maybe of the ideas from the Old Testament of God becoming angry. I mean, this is, it's like a scene from a movie where Muhammad turns into a demon or something, or a scene from Lord of the Rings. It's just really, really interesting. So emotional arguments are to be avoided in general, but sometimes they're the best method. However, nowhere in this document is he providing specific technical arguments. There's not one place, right, where he really says, well, these are the technical arguments. He always says, change the subject, change the subject, change the subject. Try not to defend this, change the subject. Rather than getting bogged down into technical, change the subject. So what is he really saying? I mean, he's saying things, but he contradicts himself. So he's really, really saying, be emotional. I mean, is he saying anything else that I'm missing here?
No, I mean, we will eventually see that he gives some very weak defenses for some of the problems in Islam, but it's mostly focused on deflection, distraction, making Christians feel bad about something in their religion, and then they'll forget about the bad thing in Islam.
Yeah. He goes on again in discussing method of delivery. He says, everyone likes to hear information relayed in the form of a story. Okay, fine, but what if they're asking you technical questions? He's answered to people who have technical questions, specific, detailed questions that require a discussion of theology. He says, now's not the time and place, change the subject, talk about something else, and then talk about the superiority of Islam. So where does he say, hold on, let's deal with this, right? But he says, no, tell them a story, because everyone loves to hear a story, right? And of course, he's definitely going to give you a story. And he says, from bards and storytellers of the past, that may be, but we're not here to listen to fairy tales, right? So hence the Quran and the Sunnah has in a number of instances employed the narrative format to convey its message in the most intriguing manner. So now again, he's talking about emotional appeal, emotional appeal. It's yeah, so he has no technical information because he's not allowed to provide technical information to the students learning from him. While many of the most popular narratives are made up by their authors, the Quran and Hadithic stories are all true. So which popular narratives are made up? Because he's referring to stories and narratives employed in Islam. So which of these popular narratives are invented? That's my first question. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure what he's referring to as far as the made up stories go, but I do find this quite ironic because the Quran in reality is one of the least narrative pieces of work I've ever seen in human history.
It's insane. And if we read through, I mean, so where you talk of narrative would be in the Sirah, which are the biographies of Muhammad, the equivalent roughly of what we consider the Gospels, right? The Gospels of Jesus. Now, the Sirat comes from the original Islamic word for war, siyar. It's the plural of siyar, right? So siyar means war. So the original biographies of Muhammad really are about the wars of Muhammad, religion of peace, right? So his gospels are stories of his wars, right? And there you learn about all the miracles of Muhammad, how Muhammad would have the trees walk behind him like camels to shield him when he went to the loo in the bush. how the rocks would form a big circle around him when he went to the loo in the bush, how the ground would open up and the sweet smell would come out. Yeah, how Muhammad hit a rock and the rock turned into sand, this big rock that he hit, and how he cooked food for 1,000 people with a single lamb and 3 kilograms of barley. All of these popular narratives. And you'll find stories like this in the most famous of the biographies of Muhammad, called the Ash-Shifa, the Ashshifa, the Ash-Shifa. That is where all of these miraculous stories. Now we're told that all of these stories are true. But why is it Muslims are constantly saying that's a weak hadith? Even when we quote Bukhari or Muslim, Aisha was not 9 years old. Aisha was 18 years old. Your thoughts, that is?
Yeah, it's funny how that works, that the original Muslims had no problems with these stories, but now that they're embarrassing in a more educated society, they somehow are weak, meaning that it's doubtful they go back to Muhammad, or at least somewhat uncertain. So a weak hadith supposedly is 50 to 75% certain that goes back to Muhammad, or whatever the precise percentages they say are. But either way, it's not a Sahih hadith where it's 99.9% certain it goes back to Muhammad.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it says that these stories are not made up by Allah and His Messenger to convey His message. So they're not allegories, let's say, but they are in fact true historical examples of the message. So the story where Moses has his clothes stolen by a rock, and the rock runs away, and Moses chases the stone and beats it with a stick. That's true. It's a true historical example of the message. I'm not sure what the message of chasing a rock and beating it with a stick happens to be, but this is a major scholar of Islam. I am supposed to believe him, right?
I guess so.
Yeah, and Allah refers to the Quran as truth. So the Quran refers to itself as truth. That's fantastic. I revealed the book to you in truth. Really, is it saying this thing revealed the book to you? Truly, James gave you the book. So it's true that James gave you the book, or I revealed the book to you in truth. Is it saying that the book is the truth, or truly, I gave you the book? Because
that's a good question, but even if we take it the way Bilal wants it to be taken, that's not a very good argument. That's like saying, here's my revelation and proof that it's actually true. See line 10, it says this is true.
yeah, I mean, true. We've got Miss Piggy saying Allah doesn't know the books before Islam. He doesn't have a very good understanding of what came before Islam. That much is true. And he speaks of there's 140,000 prophets, but all they know are the ones in the Old Testament. So,
Yeah, very odd that Allah doesn't seem to know about any of the biblical history, just a
yeah.
few
So,
vague references.
and he said Mad Mo made an average of 10 converts a year during the Meccan period before he had time to kill all who proved him wrong, which is true. He only had about 150 converts at most after his first 13 years. Then he became a political leader, and then he became wealthy. Then he became a warlord. He raised an army, and then he was powerful. So yeah, he was a failure until the time he gained political and military power. So the message of Islam is success is at the point of the sword.
And of course, he's
What's
the best.
interesting, yeah,
I was saying, of course, he's the best example to follow. So if that's
yeah,
how Muhammad actually convinced people that Islam is true, then that's what other people should do too.
yeah. And what's interesting is now we've just been told by Bilal that the Quran and Hadithic stories are all true. But here we've got from the Reliance of the Traveler, again, the world's most famous Sharia manual, scholars disagree about the Quranic verses and hadiths that deal with the attributes of Allah, such as his hand, Quran 48:10, where they say that Allah's hand is over the group being the Muslims, the believers. So the questions that these scholars ask are, does Allah only have one hand? They also obviously have in the hadith that Allah has two right hands. So Allah has two right hands. That's fascinating because Allah can't have a left hand because the left hand is evil, the left hand path. And then, of course, in other hadiths, Allah has two right sides to his body. In other words, Allah is deformed.
It's a good point.
I wish they would start making sense. So if we are to believe the hadiths are all true, then we have to believe these hadiths. But they can't decide. Does he have one hand, two right hands, or both sides of his body are right sides? How do you have two right sides?
Yeah, that's a complete mystery to me. I don't, you could have two right hands, you could have two arms on the same side of your body, but I don't know how you have two right sides.
If I got someone else's right hand, I could hold two right hands. I could have one right hand and hold another right hand in my left hand. You know, there are ways and there are means, but yeah. You know, what is interesting is in Christianity, we are taught that we are made in the image of God, right? Now, that's not necessarily to say that we are made in the physical image of God, but notice Jesus came in our image as a human, right? And we are in the image of God so that we are like him in spirit and we're like him in thought. And so he reciprocated. Whereas in Islam, how is there a reciprocation between you and God? How is there commonality between you and God? How does the Most High, who is so elevated, find a way to connect with us? How does this happen in Islam if your God is deformed and you can't even decide if he's got one hand or two right hands?
Yeah, good question. You know, the Islamic scriptures clearly teach over and over again that Allah is completely unlike anything in creation, which contrasts to the biblical teaching that while God is unlike human beings in most ways, he does give us his image, this key attribute, if you will, that makes us like him.
Yeah, which is very interesting theological discussion because remember, no creature of God can possess the attributes of God in Islam. So then what, you, we possess the attributes of God that were given to us, right? And we can discern these attributes. I mean, truth being something that we have to strive for. But how does Islam reconcile these really strange theological issues? And remember, Muslims are not allowed to have this conversation with us because they're not supposed to know or have it with themselves or amongst themselves. So if no creature created by God can have the attributes of God, how is there this commonality? How do you share his greatness and goodness? I mean, these are just, well, what do you think of that as a theological question?
Yeah, it's a good question for sure. You know, Muslims often tell us that Christianity must be false because God can't take on the attributes of humans, i.e., he can't become incarnate in the person of Jesus. But according to the Quran, the attributes of God include things like being just. You're saying human beings can't be just. Being loving. You're saying human beings can't be loving, and so on. You know, maybe some of the attributes of God we can't take on, and we can't be fully perfect the way God is. But to say we can't be like God in any way is rather silly.
Yeah. And also, if they say that God did not come to earth and God cannot have a son or God cannot be human, I would, that feels to me like jealousy of the fact that Allah is so far away and so incomprehensible to them. He's not personal. He's an alien, right? He's a deformed alien. He's an absentee landlord. They don't like the fact that what if we are very much like God and that's why he can relate to us in the form of a human? I just think there's this, they've tried to differentiate themselves, but they've painted themselves into a corner and they are worshiping an alien.
Yeah, I think that the Islamic conception of God on some levels is like the child's caricature of God, that, you know, God's out there and he does stuff and everything we do is to serve his pleasure. If he wants us to jump, he makes us jump, and that's the way it is. And the Quran supports that idea. Like, for example, it says that if the people had not disobeyed, God would have destroyed them and created another group of people so that they would disobey and he'd have someone to forgive. So apparently Allah needs people to disobey him so that he can forgive them. Very bizarre stuff that the God of Islam needs people to fulfill his attributes, that he's incomplete without people. But at the same time, the highest relationship you can aspire to in Islam is a master-slave type relationship. That the best thing you can do is be a slave of Allah, do whatever he wants, and then he may reward you with some nice stuff because he appreciates the labor you do for him. Whereas Christianity teaches that God wants to adopt us into his own family. He wants to have an intimate, loving relationship with us. It's just completely different conception of what God is and how we relate to God.
Yeah, and Allah made people who are going to go to hell, who have no chance of redemption, because he's chosen that these people will not have that opportunity. And don't forget, the Hadith says that 72 out of every 73 Muslims, remember there are 73 sects of Islam, 72 of them are going to hell. So you have a 1 in 73 chance of going to paradise, which is crazy. How do you deal with that? Where do you find redemption and forgiveness in Islam? And also, when you die, you are punished, you are tortured in the grave. You are the torture of the grave. They speak of this one story of a man who is squeezed in the grave by his wrappings, and he's squeezed and crushed. There's another of a man who had done something involving, I believe, a hammer, and in the grave before resurrection, he is punished by being beaten over and over with a hammer between the eyes. This is what awaits you after you die. Where's the forgiveness? Where's the salvation? And then once the resurrection happens, whatever in the Islamic end times, you then have to crawl across a razor blade, a bridge as thin as a razor blade, which will cut you and burn you, sorry, which will cut you and bleed you across hell. And the fires and flames of hell will burn you and torture you. And then you'll make it to the other side, and then cut, bleeding, and burned, you then have to retaliate against your fellow Muslims to punish them for their sins in the in life. So you have to beat them and hurt them, break their bones, make them bleed, hit them, and then after that orgy of violence and torture, then you walk to the next bridge into paradise. How is this salvation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll probably want to wrap it up here in a
Oh,
few minutes.
sorry.
This is a good place to wrap it up, I think, rather than continuing on, because the manual goes on for a long time. We weren't planning on any specific stopping point.
It's 4 more slides. We can either go through. So
It's up to you, but I just wanted to read a comment here from
okay.
Geneva. It says, at times we don't acknowledge and are thankful for our beauty and gifts, even the so-called simple ones. And that's a great thought there. Uh, and I also wanted to point out that what Lloyd was describing, that is the fate of the believing Muslim. That's not what happens to evil people. That's what happens to everyone, with the possible exception of martyrs.
Yeah, those who have killed or have been killed in jihad.
Yes.
That is crazy. So that is why jihad is so important, because if you're a jihadi, you go straight to paradise, and B, you can intercede for 72 of your family members, so you can save them from the torments of the grave. So there is no grace, there is no salvation, there is no going to heaven. There is, well, you're going to die. You've been a good Muslim, but you don't know if you have salvation. Even Muhammad says, I don't know if I am going to heaven. He says, I'm but a plain warner. Even I don't know if I have salvation. And this is shocking. So no wonder jihad is such a popular thing, because yeah, you can prevent this torture that Islam points you at. I mean, you live a good life, and then you still are going to be punished. And yeah, so shall we continue? It's 3 more slides, 16, 17, and 18, and then we're done.
Uh, let's finish the ones before the definitions and leave the definitions for
Okay,
next
cool.
time.
Yeah. So yeah, Allah repudiates the ideas that these narratives are invented. So why do they have to insist that the stories are, they have to repudiate that these narratives are invented? There's so much doubt here. There's so much front loading here. It's crazy. At the end of the story of the prophet Joseph and his brothers, it is not an invented story, but a confirmation of the previous scripture. So how is Islam a confirmation of previous biblical scripture? It is not. It is a rejection of biblical scripture, right? And consequently, it is not surprising to find the use of examples from human life to illustrate points. And figurative speech is generally a more moving and effective method of communication than direct commands and detailed explanations. Again, emotional appeal. Emotional appeal, no facts, please. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that there's two funny things here, or maybe not so much funny, but kind of sad that Muslims believe this. The first being, if you're going to create a false text to create your own new fake religion, and you're kind of incompetent at how to do that, you would probably copy some previous story, and then you would write, uh, I didn't make this up. This is a confirmation of the previous story, and put that right in your text because you knew the text was kind of weak and couldn't stand on its own. And the second thing is the story of Joseph is actually the longest, most detailed narrative in the Quran. It's one of the very few stories that's actually told in narrative fashion. And it's lifted pretty much straight from Jewish apocryphal writing, Jewish speculation about the biblical stories. And it's definitely not from the biblical story of Joseph.
Yeah, and it contradicts. Yeah, it's amazing how Allah just doesn't seem to know what came before, but that's fine. Yeah. So again, so now figurative speech, and then he speaks of gradual progression. Now, this is also part of the story that don't give people all the information, give them little bits, get them to become Muslim, and then afterwards, when it's too late, then they find out the truth. So gradual progression in Islamic law is usually illustrated by the gradual prohibition of alcohol. Similarly, if a person drinks alcohol, fornicates, and worships idols, we should not try to get to quit everything all at once. We prioritize and work our way from the most important to the very important, and from there to the important. So wean them away little by little. Don't tell them all at once. So it's not just about not getting them to quit, but don't give them all the information all at once. Don't inform them. Don't give them an informed decision.
And although Bilal doesn't say it in practice, this means lie if necessary.
Yeah.
There's a fairly well-known story about a group of Muslims doing Dawah, and they encountered a guy who, was very into drinking alcohol. And he's like, I'd become a Muslim, except that you guys don't allow to drink alcohol. And like, oh, that's a myth. You're allowed to drink as much alcohol as you want in Islam. And so the guy's like, okay, I'll convert to Islam. He says his Shahada. And then as soon as he does that, they're like, by the way, we lied to you about alcohol. You have to give up alcohol now. And he's like, well, then I'm leaving Islam. They're like, you can't do that. The penalty for leaving Islam is death.
Man, that's scary. That's scary. So yeah, they will lie to you, which is why 95% of people who convert leave Islam within 5 years. 70% leave within 3 years. So that tells us something. Um, yeah. Also, what's interesting, they speak of Islamic law, and Muslims will say, well, Islamic law, but they won't actually give us references, citations of Islamic law. At no stage has a Muslim ever given me a citation direct from the Sharia. They will not go to the Reliance of the Traveler, the Hedaya, the Minhaj al-Taliban, any of the major books from the four schools of faith. At no stage will they ever quote this, because these books are very specific. Unlike the Quran, which is very general, can be used to say anything you want. They can make it dance, sing, and you name it. Anything they'd like to have it say, that it'll say for them. But the Sharia is extremely specific. The fiqh is entirely detailed, and it's very clear, and it will destroy their lies. It will destroy their arguments, because it will prove them wrong, show them to be the liars that they are.
Absolutely. So I think that's the last slide for today.
Yeah.
Next time, we will look at Bilal's definitions of some key terms. He redefines a bunch of words that are very important for Christian-Muslim dialogue. And he does this because it allows him to say one thing in his defense of what Islam teaches, have the person hear something that they think sounds good, but he actually means something completely different. So we'll look at his definition of some terms, and then look at some of his explanations for so-called misconceptions, or what we might call obvious problems in Islam that, we just read the scriptures, the Hadith or the Quran, and go by exactly what they say and say that's what Islam teaches. And apparently just reading it is a misconception that needs explanation, and his explanation involves changing what words mean.
Yeah, as one example, the most egregious example is he redefines pedophilia as paying underage children for sex. It is only pedophilia if you pay them for sexual favors. Apparently, it's not if you didn't pay them, if they were volunteering or whatever.
Yeah, pretty disgusting stuff.
Yeah,
This is the level of desperation you have to go to defend Muhammad's actions and make it so he's not a pedophile, as you redefine pedophilia as paying for sex with minors.
yeah. So we study Islam a lot. We talk about it. We're always talking about the Quran, but it's important to understand that we're not always talking the same language. Now we're trying to learn the same language, to speak from the same point of view as the Muslims we're engaging with online. We have to know what are they taught as children, and this is what they're taught. So if we read through the madrasa manuals, we can see what they're taught as youth from the age of 4, 5 up to the age of 16 or so. But this is what their online apologists, the really active ones, this is what they're trained in. This is how badly, how poorly they are trained, how ignorant they actually are, which is shocking. I mean, he says so much and he says nothing. And he misinforms them, and he totally warps their worldview. And it's really, really sad to see.
Yeah, and this is the informed Muslims who read this, the people who really want to bring people into Islam, people who really love Islam and want others to come into it. The average Muslim is going to be even more ignorant than what Bilal is encouraging people to be.
Yeah, scary stuff. So I hope this was helpful and informative to everyone. Helps you to understand the worldview of Islam, to understand how these scholars, because if we've been watching David Wood, for instance, he says that the scholars lie to the Muslims. Now we're starting to understand how exactly, right, how they lie to them. And hopefully this helps you to understand where they come from and how to start to refute and to educate them. I mean, we do want to educate them. We do want to bring them to truth.
Absolutely. Bilal says, don't give anyone too much information. I say, more information, the better. Not that every single fact unequivocally supports Christianity, but when you look at all the facts in totality, the more information you know, the more obvious it becomes that Christianity is the true religion. So I say education is the way forward. Teaching people, teaching Muslims what their religion really teaches is probably sufficient for many to reject it. And then teaching them what Christianity really teaches is enough for them to accept Christianity.
In fact, the simplest way to determine that you're dealing with a cult is that a cult does not want you to ask questions and to have detailed knowledge. And Islam does not want its people asking questions and doesn't want them to have detailed knowledge. It says detailed knowledge will make you doubt. Well, why is that? So if you're not allowed to ask questions, well, that's a cult.
Why is that indeed? I think that's a great thought to end it on. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay tuned to this channel, Armageddon News. We'll continue the Dawah series on here in about 2 weeks, but look for an announcement on the exact time.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you guys soon.